Freakonomics.
So it turned out people loved this article. Dubner, much to his credit, created an almost completely fictitious persona about me as this unbelievable problem solver, where people would call me up with a problem, any problem, and I would stare off into space, and I'd type in my computer, and an hour later, the solution would emerge. I mean, I know nothing could be further from the truth, but I must say, I have exploited that, that fictitious persona without any restraint for the last 7 years, and I'm going to continue doing it. The problem was that Dubner had told me he wanted to interview me for 2 hours. And 36 hours of interviews later, he was still there. And I hated him more than any person on earth at that point. But the problem is, you can't be mean to a New York Times reporter. I mean, as much as you want that person to leave, you know that anything you say will be used against you. So I had to very politely tolerate him for 36 hours. So I didn't really want to write an article, a book with him. And to be honest, you didn't want to write one with me either. It's a very, I mean, you were kind of a big shot in the New York literary world, and to write what they call an "and" book, so Levitt and Dubner, was very demeaning in Dubner's circles. We agreed on one thing, which is that if they would give us a boatload of money, we'd write this book. Well, when I got the news, I called my parents and I said, "You're not going to believe it, but they gave us this much money to write a book." And my father said, "Give the money back." He said, it's immoral of you to take that money from the publishers because no one wants to read about the stupid crap that you research. I want to talk about how I got there. I think it's kind of interesting to talk about how I got there because I do ridiculous research that you can't imagine why anyone would actually be interested in. And it's not the kind of research that real economists do. And I wanted to be a real economist. Alan Greenspan was my idol when I was growing up. I wanted to be the kind of economist when I made a terrible mistake, markets were put into convulsions and the whole world got turned upside down. And it never occurred to me I'd be an academic economist until one day, a few years out of school, I had this epiphany that that was my calling. Now, I knew nothing about what it meant to be an academic economist, no idea at all, but I applied to schools. And for reasons looking back I'll never understand, I was admitted to the MIT PhD program in economics. This is probably the most rigorous economics program in the world. And I was optimistic. I showed up excited about the new path my life was going to take. And that optimism lasted no more than 2 or 3 minutes into my first lecture. So this has now been 7 or 8 years since I'd taken a math class, Math Monet, and the professor was scribbling the equations up on the board. And in these equations were all sorts of D's. Now, I remembered enough from Math 1A to know that a D stood for a derivative. But the thing that kind of threw me for a loop was it almost seemed like there were 2 different kinds of D's in these equations. There was a regular old D, and there was something almost like a script D. And I had never in my life seen a script D in an equation. So I just wrote it off to bad penmanship, and I've looked back at my notes, and I just wrote D, 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 and I didn't worry about it. But the longer this lecture went on, the more worried I became, because it was really clear that these regular old D's would be one on top of each other, and these script D's would be one on top of each other. And I finally, as much as I hated to do it, I bit the bullet. And I turned to the guy sitting next to me, and I whispered to him, I said, hey, is there a difference between the straight D and the curly D? And he turned back to me and he simply said, "You are in so much trouble." And how right he was, because this curly D I'd never seen before. That's a partial derivative. It is the most central concept in economics. I'd never heard of it.